If I had to sum this war up in one sentence, I would say it's almost like a prize fight, and we're in the seventh round. And the big guy that you thought was going to win is now getting pummeled by a guy who's a little bit smaller but has much better technique. There's a population on Crimea that needs gasoline, they need food, they need water. All right, there is a civilian population on Crimea. Everyone talks about the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the bridge that connects mainland Russia with Crimea. Kerch Strait Bridge has always been this holy grail for Ukraine. If we can only destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge, then it'll cause stresses on Russia that'll make it more difficult to supply Crimea. A lot of it is this level of, well, if we can take out this bridge, then Russia has to spend more fuel getting supplies across the Kerch Strait to supply Crimea. There should be a rail line now in Russian-occupied Crimea that can send stuff over there. So destroying the bridge would make things harder, wouldn't necessarily make it impossible. You also have sea lift capability, transport ships. Again, makes things harder. Just means Russians won't be able to vacation in Crimea anymore. Not that you'd want to vacation in a war zone, but okay. But ships float. Those ships that are floating can be attacked. So Crimea, I've always said you want to create dilemmas, not problems for your adversary. A problem has a solution. A dilemma has two or more solutions, each of which are equally bad. So if I destroy a bridge, okay, fine, I float supplies across. But if I have the capability through unmanned surface vehicles to destroy those ships that are floating across the Kerch Strait, well, now I give the Russians a dilemma, right? Well, now maybe I have to take the long way around rail infrastructure in the north, or I have to use trucks, or I have to evacuate the population. So that's a dilemma. You always want to give your adversary dilemmas, not problems. It's going to be very difficult for Russia to do all of those things. The problem is that Russia is very, very big. People don't really understand how big Russia actually is. With the way that you think air defense works, you don't necessarily have air defense all over the front. It's not like a game of chess where you put all your pawns up front and that's your air defense. You tend to have air defense layered in depth. So you would have some air defense on the front lines. Then you have some air defense around critical infrastructure. Then you have some air defense around cities. And the problem is that there's never enough. There's never enough of anything. So you have to periodically think about, all right, where am I going to put this air defense for it to be the most effective? And in a lot of cases, there's more targets than there is air defense. Ukraine just has to figure out where the air defense systems are not located, and they can just go around those gaps. And you can do that with satellite footage. You can do that with spies on the ground. There's a lot of ways to do that. However, when it comes to actually defending, you have a limited number of air defense equipment, and you have to be right every single time. So no, Russia can't protect every single inch of its territory. We can't either. You know, it would be extremely difficult to do that just because the country is so big. You know, that's kind of one of the disadvantages of Russia kind of being on the defense now. They really have to think about that. And they never really counted on this war going on so long, and the Ukrainians developing the kind of cruise missile tech and long-range drone tech that could actually reach out and strike some other factories. Crimea is, for Russia, Crimea is an own goal, right? It's a problem that Russia created for itself. When you think about the actual operation to take Crimea from a tactical standpoint, where they had little green men come in and nobody wanted to fight Russia, nobody wanted to stand up to Russia over Crimea. And honestly, at the time, the Ukrainian military was so bad, they wouldn't have been able to retake Crimea anyway. But now you have this gigantic weight around you because you have this massive peninsula with people living on it, Russian citizens living on it, all of whom are going to complain because now they're within range of Ukrainian missiles. And now they're also a prime target. So you've taken what was an incredible victory, if you were Russian. And you've turned it into this thing that you have to feed, you have to get water to, you have to supply, you have to maintain electrical infrastructure that is fairly close to Ukraine, within cruise missile range, within drone range. And that's just not something I think Russia really counted on at the start of the war, that they would have this gigantic population of Russians so close to the front. And so now Crimea is almost like a hindrance to Russian objectives than it is an actual help. So one option might be to kind of do what he's doing now and threatening the West by periodically sending drones over to NATO countries. That'll hit an apartment building, maybe hit an oil refinery, to kind of remind NATO that if you continue to help Ukraine, we can drag you into the war. One big difference between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and a lot of Western countries, NATO countries, is that these people are not used to living, these people aren't used to hardship, right? The average Romanian, the average Pole, does not have to worry about getting blown up on the way to work. And two things can happen when Russia periodically sends drones into the Baltics. Well, actually, probably not the Baltics. The Baltics are, I think the only reason we have U.S. forces in the Baltics is to prevent them from kicking Russia's but from like actually invading Russia themselves. I've been to Estonia. They don't like Russia too much. But I could easily see, depending on the leadership in some NATO countries, I could see some NATO countries saying, you know what, we're not going to help Ukraine anymore because they're just these Russian attacks on our infrastructure, even these masked, oops, we didn't really mean to send drones, it's too much. I don't want my people to have to suffer, so we're just not going to help Ukraine. And that's penny wise and pound foolish, which is an American expression for we're doing something that's easy now and we're going to have to do something that's hard later. So that's one option, where Russia convinces NATO countries not to support Ukraine anymore. The other option is that Russia goes through a general mobilization, where I can tell you that there's always been this deal between Russian leadership and the Russian elites or the Russian intellectuals, the middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the deal has always been this: do whatever the hell you want on the world stage, but don't touch our kids. As long as you're recruiting people from Siberia, people who aren't ethnically Russian, murder them all you want in whatever war you want. But if you start drafting people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, you're going to have a problem. If Russia were to create a general mobilization and actually draft middle and upper middle class people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, it would solve their manpower problem, but it would create another problem of a lot of people and a lot of Russian elites who do not like the direction that this is going, because now it's affecting them personally. So that could be an option, but you're really dealing with two options of bad and worse, because all it's going to take is some NATO country to say these Russian incursions are too much, I'm going to invoke Article 5, and now that's something Russia doesn't want, because the second NATO gets their act together and says we're going to put an end to Russia once and for all, they're done. They're done. And NATO could shut down Russian air defenses in about 36 to 48 hours. And when you have actual NATO troops coming into Ukraine to kick Russia out, that there's not much they're going to be able to do to stop that. There aren't a lot of options for Russia right now other than a general mobilization or to try to antagonize NATO to the point where they drop support for Ukraine.